Cienfuegos tiene ya su guaguancó.
We're joined today by Gladys Ayllon, and you're coming to us all the way from Cuba. Bienvenidos, Gladys, and welcome to Ireland.
Thank you very much. It is really a pleasure to come back.
Gladys, you're with an organisation called I.C.A.P. Can you just briefly tell our listeners what's I.C.A.P?
Well, I am working for an organization that is precisely I.C.A.P stands for Cuban Institute for Friendship with the Peoples. And the main purpose of our work is to give an updated and current information about Cuba, and just to counter-arrest the silence wall around Cuba and our perspective. So this organization was founded in 1960, in December 1960, precisely as or so as to make a bridge from Cuba to the rest of the world. At that moment, most of all the diplomatic embassies get out of Cuba. So I.C.A.P was like the bridge to maintain people informed about the new coming process coming in Cuba, and still we are doing that function.
Sure. Perhaps we need updating in this part of the world, because when we look at Cuba, I sometimes think our image is stuck about 1960. It's about, it's men with revolutionaries with beards, smoking cigars, vintage cars, liberty, equality. Updated to, certainly the images have changed, even the people have changed. They've got older, haven't they? How much does that need updating to people like ourselves?
Well, I believe that since 1959, Cuba has been changing a lot. And it's true that in the big media, to mention Cuba is always just to think about Fidel or just this island for beach and tourism in the Caribbean. And Cuba is much more than that. So we have been fighting very hard to develop a cultural field, for instance, the education, the public health system, but also it is a matter of giving the human or the real human rights to the majority of our population. So updating Cuba, at the moment we are under this process of bettering the life standard in Cuba, and the main cause of this is to avoid imports in Cuba, save money. As you know, Cuba have been blockaded for 54 years, and even people think blockade is a very cold word. Blockade is affecting a lot of our economy. Blockade is a really harsh impact in our Cubans living every day. So the nowadays in Cuba, the nowadays policy is precisely to continue encouraging people to fight for socialism and to fight for our system, the one we have been choosing.
Talk about 1959, and the major image we have is Fidel. I mean, Fidel was a giant of the 20th century, and in some respects now, particularly with people like me, it's sad to see an old man. It reminds us of ourselves. Is it a mistake to focus on personalities in Cuba? Would it be better off for outsiders to have a look at the totality rather than the individual?
Well, it is true that Fidel, as you said, a giant of the 20th century and also 21st century, because he's still there with us, is someone that has been the leader of the revolution, creating the ideas and things. But I may say that Fidel is not the revolution as such. So it's a big part of it. But when you are inside of Cuba, that's the image abroad. But when you are inside of Cuba, people look at Fidel like that big leader, as I mentioned. But in Cuba, there have been a really huge communication between the oldest generations and the new generations. So it's like the strength, the power of the old generations with their living, with their experiences of the old times, And now the new generations with the education, with the high level of instruction, knowing that we have no reference, we have no model to copy, because our neighbor countries, Europe, have nothing to show us when we talk about human rights, when we talk about the conditions for the majority. So I believe we, the young ones, we are instructed enough to know that the only way for Cuba is precisely our system. So if we change, for instance, for capitalism, we won't have the capitalism that have been designed for Europe.
Sure.
So we will have the capitalism that have been a third category, capitalism that have been designed for our neighbor countries like Guatemala, Nicaragua, El Salvador, all those countries.
Politically, Cuba was seen from 1959-60 up to 1990 as within the Soviet sphere. Now, I won't put it any more than that. How was the collapse of the Soviet Union perceived in Cuba, particularly politically? Was this seen as, this is a warning sign, this is something we should take heed of, or was this seen as an inevitable consequence of a system that really wasn't able to reform itself?
Well, I believe that the Soviet Union, the ex-Soviet Union, they have their own way of running the country. They have their own politics, even if they were also part of the socialist bloc.
Sure.
But in Cuba, I believe, even if we have very closed connection economically, Cuba also have, and also we have now our own model. So when the Soviet Union collapsed, for us it was incredibly harsh. It was really a hit for Cuban economy. But for the Cubans as such, I remember the 90s were really hard. I was just in the university. And we lost most of all the 80% of imports. We have almost nothing, food. But it was really, how can I say? It was an encouragement for us not to have, exactly,
yeah,
not to have the same result of the ex-Soviet Union. So most of the people thought, and gave us days for the collapse also of the Cuban Revolution. But it was, as you said, the awakening of the Cuban spirit, the nation, to survive.
Something that is very interesting to notice with Russia, I'm not going to say Russia, the Soviet Union are the same. When the Soviet Union collapsed, we suddenly discovered that Christianity wasn't very far below the surface. It was a force there. How is that happening in Cuba now? Because is Christianity, although you have nominally a socialist system, is Christianity, particularly Catholicism in Latin America, is that important within Cuba now, or is it still seen as something from pre-revolution?
No, let me tell you something. In Cuba, Christianity have been part also of the society, but it's not the most seen religious. That we have an Afro-Cuban
Sure.
culture. It's a syncretism that we have. But the strength of our revolution have been precisely that all of the religious sectors are integrated to the Cuban Revolution. So we cannot talk about Christianism or Catholics or a Yoruba religion. So everybody is mixed and everybody is formed of the same process.
You said when the Soviet Union collapsed, you lost 80% of your imports, and I'm assuming a great deal of that was energy and fuel and oil and things like that. Did people ever think, hold on, the economy we had, like it happened in Ireland, when suddenly there was no capital available, we suddenly realised it was an illusion what we were being, that our economy was largely an illusion. It was based on credit, it was based on, we weren't producing things. How was that perceived in Cuba? Did people suddenly think, hold on, our economy isn't really what we were told it was?
Well, I think that what we thought that time was that precisely our economy was very inefficient while we were having lots of imports coming to Cuba. And it was something really good that from the 90s on, we started to develop, for instance, the urban gardens, the organoponics, agriculture in general. And it was also a matter of creativeness in the generations that make us survive. So it was an example that we had a lot of not only braveness to survive, but also we have the instruction, we have the creativity to maintain the country. And when you look at, for instance, how biotechnology field developed during those years, it's really incredible that in the middle of the special period of we call the 90s, we discovered the only vaccination against meningitis, for instance, that is unique in the world. So it was like the special period or these hard times pushed the Cubans to be better.
Okay. An interesting point then, when I look at Cuba in terms of the economy, I see several things. I see primary industry, agriculture, particularly tobacco and sugar. I also then see on the other end highly educated workforce, particularly in medicine and, as you say, in a few of the sciences as well. And then I see a third sector, which is tourism. Now, the first two, there is, between the primary industry, because you've got the resources there, which is agriculture and so on, and climate, which is very important. You then have the highly educated workforce at a certain level. It's putting those together, and often I find it's capital that's putting them together. Is that a very major stumbling block, the fact that by and large Cuba is excluded from capital markets?
I'm not an economist.
Sure, yeah, no,
But just from my very humble point of view, I believe that even if we have had the resources, like the good climate, beaches, hotels, and also a very social population for increasing tourism, for instance, I believe that also one of the main purposes of bettering our economy have been to be more efficient and to take advantage of that high instruction we had and continue, of course, bettering with the exchanges, learning every day from other countries as well, and being inside the dynamic of Cuba, but also with this interaction with our population and with also friends from abroad.
The American economy, because of proximity and a few other things, was probably a significant, if not the major, shall we say, interest of Cuba. I know that you had an economic relationship with the Soviet Union. That has changed to a certain degree, particularly with the emergence of Latin America. I mean, the economies of Latin America now offer much more of an alternative to Cuba than perhaps Europe might have in the past. How important is that development in Latin America that perhaps wasn't there, say, even 20 years ago?
Well, fortunately for Cuba, we have these, as you mentioned, alternative like the Bolivarian Alliance for the Americas. We have now CELAC, that is a mechanism formed by all the Latin American and Caribbean countries in the region. And these exchanges of fairly and all the resources we have been keeping our economy in a good figure, I believe. But I have to mention here that it's been really tough for Cuba because, after 1961, when the blockade was officially established, we did lost all the relationship, all the market with the United States. And it is something that we are still fighting against, and make people aware that the blockade is there, affecting Cuban economy, and not also affecting Cuban economy, but also affecting the Cuban people.
Sometimes may seem cynical, but I've asked people that when we hear of a blockade, we hear of Gaza, we hear of that area, and I've been saying to people for quite some time, there is a blockade of Cuba that's been going on for a lot longer. It's probably much more extensive. Why is that never talked about? Do you think that is actually down to the American press?
It's precisely this wall of silence around Cuba, trying to isolate Cuba, and also trying to isolate the real strategy of the power of the United States. For instance, I will mention an example. When Obama got into the administration of the United States, many people thought that after his promises, things were going to be better, the normalization of the relationships. But Obama hasn't accomplished any of the promises he made. On the other hand, transactions for Cuba, bank transfers towards Cuba, everything have been under a control, under constantly tracing, and is part precisely of the economic blockade against Cuba. And people that haven't been affected, they cannot realize it. But nowadays, we can talk about lots of companies that they have been closed or close their possibility to deal with Cuba or to have any market with Cuba because they have a third companion or the third intermediary that is working with the United States. And it's really visible that in Cuba, for instance, we cannot make any transfer with US dollars because they believe we are doing this money laundering, that we are dealing with terrorists. So something that for us is really, I may say stupid, but anyway, people, when they do not know the reality of Cuba, when they haven't traveled to Cuba, they believe that just a blockade is something that is not happening.
What does the average Cuban think then? I mean, a blockade has been going on now, short of killing, when you suppress people or you lock them up or whatever, short of killing them, there's not much more you can actually do. Do people see that the blockade now is not really serving much of an effective purpose, because as you say, Cubans are resourceful people, that it is there purely as a punishment and it's more ideological than anything else?
I think that is part of this ideological, this political conflict, differendum, we can call it many ways, between Cuba and the United States. And when your child is sick and you are hospitalized, and you cannot apply medicine, the doctor said that the only way we can have the medicine or the medication is if someone, a friend, is coming from the United States because we cannot deal with them. And some people have been, Friends of Cuba organizations, have been trying to break the blockade, bringing their medicines, running the risk. But some of the children are having problems in Cuba precisely after not having the medication because you can only get it in the United States. So this is a genocide, very concrete example. Looking at opportunities as opposed to problems,
it seems to me that there are several areas of opportunity that for the Cuban economy, that the United States could have minimum impact. One clearly is tourism. How important that is tourism for Cuba? And second point then is, how good are the facilities once you get there? I'm hearing different things, so that's why I'd be interested to hear yourself.
Have you been in Cuba before?
I haven't. I've got family that go to Cuba regularly, and they tell me great things.
Okay, good. So I must say that in Cuba we have had a really a good increase in the sector of tourism, especially with the facilities, hotels, spa and everything. But at the moment, tourism is not the first income in our economy. So even if we are still fighting for people to come to Cuba for these reasons, to know our reality and also for our economy, believe it or not, tourism has...
It's diminished.
Exactly. Okay. And at the moment, the most of the important lines in our economy are biotechnology, and all this sector of collaboration with other countries in public health system.
When we talk about biotechnology, are we talking about state corporations that are, or are you doing that in conjunction with transnational corporations?
When I mention biotechnology, it's pure Cuban factories and scientists that are elaborating different vaccines, medication, treatments. So we now can talk about a huge improvement doing antiretrovirals for people that are suffering from AIDS, vaccines against lung cancer, for instance. We are having lots of treatments for cancer with these poisons after the scorpion that is purely Cuban. And all these vaccines have been just discovered with the scientists, Cuban scientists, inside of our country. So we have been also exchanging these kind of vaccines or medication or medicines with other countries, as Cuba also have improved the source of fabricating or doing our own medicines.
So do you see, as time evolves, and we'll assume that ultimately the blockade is lifted because politicians die and things change. Now, do you see the Cuban economy as one that develops with a smaller agricultural sector, in other words, a more efficient agricultural sector, less people working but still producing the same output, and the Cuban economy developing more as what I would call a smart economy, that, like you say, in biotechnology, perhaps that's the opportunity for small nations like Ireland and like Cuba.
I believe that also there, after all this popular referendum we had before the 6th Congress of the Communist Party, there is a consciousness in Cuban population that we must develop, we must continue developing the agricultural sector, not only because of the need of food and of the sector as such, but also to avoid imports and trying to relieve a bit our economy from this high importation, because we should have been importing from the United States very easily. But after the blockade, we have to import from very long distance regions, like from Asia, from Vietnam, coming to Cuba. So I believe that we are going in the right track, developing the economy, something that is really difficult, but at the same time, people are really aware that is the only alternative for surviving and also for keeping the conquest the revolution has given us.
When we talk, if you turn on your television when you go back from here and you look at CNBC or one of what we would call the financial channels, we don't talk about, Latin America we used to talk about the third world, and Africa was the third world. We don't talk about that anymore. We talk about emerging markets. Cuba ultimately will be an emerging market. Isn't it inevitable that Cuba will have to embrace, to a certain degree, some form of market-driven economy? I'm not saying capitalism, but some form of market-driven economy. In other words, people will be able to retain more of what they Is that the way it's going, or
no,
is
I don't think so. Cuba, according to all the results of these exchanges and debates, we won't be inside of this market economy. We will continue with the planned economy, and also trying to get this opportunity of exchanging with our neighboring countries, like people that are part of the ALBA and CELAC, as I told you.
Sure.
So main means of productions will continue in the hands of the state, and those ones that are having their own businesses or their own public sector inside of the public sector, they will share the means of production, but not as a private enterprise. So we are not having private enterprise.
If Mr. and Mrs. Gonzalez wanted to start a small restaurant, would that not be an option in Cuba?
It is an option.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking.
Yes, it is an option, but we don't deal with that kind of option like a private enterprise. It's just they are working in the public sector with the facility that they can have their own restaurant, for instance, paying a tax to the state. But here we are not thinking on people that can have, for instance, 20 workers working for them,
Or having a chain of Gonzalez restaurants.
Exactly.
Well, I suppose one of the criteria we use to judge the success of an economy or the success of a society is how willing people are to leave it. Now, my understanding is that more people have left Ireland over the last, say, 5 to 10 years, certainly 5 years, than have left Cuba. Now, that suggests that, for whatever reason, people are less satisfied with the Irish economy than the Cuban economy. Are you saying that people are more prepared to, shall we make compromises for equality and fairness than simply to enrich themselves the way we've adopted it here?
I believe that to have this kind of public sector more enlarged It's something that tells you that there is a commitment of the Cubans to better the economy and to be part of this natural, let me say, process. So I see it like a very, how can I say, natural, spontaneous between quotation marks, because everything is now under a plan. But consciousness, it's more reached. People are more committed. People are nowadays talking about, we would like to better our country, we would like to better our living standard. So we are talking about the majority. It's not like people would like to feel that they are having a larger income in their family, because in all these processes it's important to mention that people are aware that this is part of the will of the government. So we are going to have a different economy, but based on the living standards for the majority. So we are not talking that things are going to change as a matter of that you are going to pay the school or pay public attention. So it is really a huge challenge for the government to maintain the conquest we have achieved with the Cuban Revolution. But now, as the Cuban people are aware, I believe that with their help, with our help, improving the economy, the country will survive, and no doubt that it's going to be a better socialism.
If we were probably talking to Americans off the record, they would probably say, well, the Cuban Revolution will only survive as long as the Castros. That once the Castros go, that the revolution will be in jeopardy. Are you saying that the foundation that has been laid down now, that it will transcend personalities, in other words, that the system is strong enough now to survive the passing of what is clearly, as we say, a giant of the 20th century?
But I believe Cuba, it is there, and Cuba is going to be there with or without that generation people are used to talking about, especially the Castros. Castro have been part of our political development, also about part of our social development after creating many measures after the Cuban Revolution. But what the most important thing, and I will encourage people to look for, is that Cuba has a history. So Cuba has, how can I say, Cuba is now matured after being an independent nation with a very itself culture. So Cuba is going to be Cuba all the time. So we have learned so much that we cannot dare to let those conquests to go away. So we have to keep on fighting for maintaining Cuba the way it is, or better, I may say. Exactly, and that is the main objective precisely of I.C.A.P, or one of them, is to encourage people to come to Cuba. Cuba is not a paradise, but it's neither hell. So we are not a perfect country, none is, because it's just formed by human beings. But people must check what is happening in Cuba. There are many alternatives to come to Cuba. So for the young ones, we have volunteer work brigades, that is a full variety program. We have these study visits also. So people have to look for these alternatives to come.
What about, we'll finish on a romantic note, is it a great marriage destination? Can people from here go to Cuba and get married?
Well, I don't think it's a marriage destination, but if people fall in love, why not?
On that note, Gladys Ayllon, it has been a pleasure talking to you. So
Thank you very much. Thanks to you.
Cienfuegos tiene